Okay, guys, we're going to go through here the notes for chapter 7.5. This is part 5, entitled The Harlem Renaissance. In the last section, you recall, we looked at the cultural or the pop culture innovations and the explosion of pop culture that started to take place in the 1920s. There was also an explosion of cultural significance in the African American community. In Italian, the word Renaissance means rebirth. So you can kind of look at this as a sense of an African American cultural rebirth, where the focal point was in Harlem in New York City. So that's what part 5 is all about. So let's get started here. Some of the things you want to know for part 5, you want to be able to at least explain and analyze what the racial and economic philosophies were of a gentleman. His name was Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was one of the prominent new African-American leaders to emerge during the 1920s. So you want to be able to explain what he was all about. You also want to be able to at least briefly explain the development and impact that jazz had, the new music called jazz, on American society. Remember, this was the decade known as the Jazz Age. So be able to talk about jazz if you are asked. And then the third one, you want to be able to at least talk about the themes and the concepts that were explored by some of the African-American writers of the Harlem Renaissance as well. So those things we're going to be talking about here in this brief lecture on part 5. So one of the overall main questions here for 7.5 is how did African-Americans express this new sense of hope and pride that they were feeling and experiencing during the 1920s? And in large part, many, very, very similar, I should say, to the immigrants who traveled from Europe and from Asia, African Americans who left the South also were dreaming of a better future, and many left the South to go north in what was known as the Great Migration. And they had heard stories, of course, of economic opportunity, greater social advancement, greater political rights. So they reasoned that the South was basically a dead end. The United States had gone through the era of Jim Crow, segregation in the South. Segregation, by the way, was still the law of the land in the South in the 1920s, and it was even practiced in the North. But many blacks and other African Americans reasoned that the North was a better bet to achieve those rights I mentioned earlier if they did move north. So they were in the South, they were locked into low-paying rural jobs. They were barred from attending decent schools. The South was just very oppressive because of the Jim Crow laws, the threats of lynching. All of them combined led African Americans to migrate to the North. So what this led to was this flowering, or this rebirth, if you will, of music and literature eventually that would happen in the North, specifically in Harlem. At least that's where it more or less originated. And most African Americans who did migrate north probably found a better life. Wages tended to be higher, especially in the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Auto manufacturers like Ford in Detroit were better than working for a sharecropper in the South. Cities like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, like I said, Cleveland would be another. African Americans found more of a stronger political voice. There also existed a more of an African American middle class. So that allowed many African Americans to become ministers or physicians in some way, or lawyers or teachers, more white collar professions than what they were finding in the South. And by moving north, many African Americans were hoping anyway to escape racism and oppression. Unfortunately, racism and oppression did also exist in the North. On average, probably, they were forced to live in as poor housing conditions or labor conditions as some of the lowest paying jobs in the South. And there were race riots that took place in 1919 and 1920 as well in the North. So they did escape racism and oppression entirely. New York's Harlem district became the focal point of many of their aspirations and their goals and their dreams, and thousands of African Americans moved to Harlem. Roughly 200,000 blacks settled in Harlem. So that's mainly what this section here in chapter 7 is about. Like I said, many African Americans were attracted to northern cities because they dreamed of a better way of life. They hoped to escape the poverty and the racism that existed in the South. The North did offer higher wages. Like I said, there was evidence of a middle class, and discrimination did exist in the North, like I said. However, African Americans also did face low-paying jobs, poor housing, and the threat, like I said, of race riots, some of the bloodiest race riots started to happen in some of the larger cities in Detroit and New York around the turn of the decade, 1919, 1920, and 21. All right. So despite the large migration of African Americans north, many took the chance. Many balanced, the pros and the cons between North and South, and many of them did end up migrating north because of the overall better economic opportunities. The focal point of this migration, like I said, was Harlem in New York City. And over the course of the 20s, this would blossom into the focal point of northern migration. And like I said, about 200,000 African Americans would settle just in Harlem alone. And migrants from the South mixed with, other recently arriving immigrants from the Caribbean, for example, like Jamaica, turned Harlem into a very diverse portion or section of New York City. And it was a really dynamic blend of different cultures and traditions. And these people were bringing their traditions and values and ideals and music and whatnot to Harlem. And it really turned it into a blending, kind of a mixing pot of diverse culture. One of the prominent Jamaican-born immigrants was a gentleman named Marcus Garvey. And I said a couple minutes ago when we were looking at that objective page, one of the things you want to know about Marcus Garvey is be able to explain or analyze what his differing philosophies were regarding race and culture in terms of, in context of the African American during the 1920s. And he was a prominent African American leader, and he was, like I said, born in Jamaica. He traveled very widely before immigrating to Harlem around 1916, I think it was, 1917. And based on his travels, he basically came to one really important conclusion. And that was that wherever he went, he noticed that blacks were being exploited. Didn't matter where he was. So to combat this problem, he promoted the idea of universal black nationalism. And he organized what eventually would be called the Back to Africa movement, where the prominent idea, or he promoted the idea of separation of the races. So we didn't talk much about two men, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. These two were prominent black leaders in the 1870s and 80s and 1890s, and those two men basically called for blacks and whites to work largely together to help improve America. But unlike those two men, Marcus Garvey, like I said here, called for the separation of the races. In fact, he founded the Back to Africa movement, and his association, known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, largely called for or advocating for the separation of the races. And Garvey's message, this separatist message, found a lot of willing people to convert to his line of thinking, mainly in American cities. And at its height, the UNIA had about 2.5 million members in it. So he had plenty of people who were supporting his cause. And his advocacy of black pride and black support of black-run businesses won a lot of support. He was a leader that supported black-owned businesses and believed that blacks should own their own businesses, and he had a lot of support for that message. Garvey's movement eventually, however, fell apart by 1925, 6, and 7, so it was really the second half of the decade. The federal government sent him to prison for mail fraud, and then he was actually deported back to Jamaica. So without him as the leader, the UNIA lost a lot of its appeal and a lot of its focus. Even though the movement died, the ideas that he promoted really didn't fade all that much, because these ideas, these separatist ideas, separation of the races, would be prominent again by the 1950s and 60s to the Black Power movement and Malcolm X. If you're familiar with who Malcolm X is, the ideas of Black Pride and these cultural ties to Africa. So he was one of the early leaders to call for black separatism apart from whites. And his legacy, I guess you could call it, would be his ideas would last well into the 50s and 60s and early 70s during the civil rights movement. Switching gears a little bit, we know the 1920s, I mentioned earlier, was known as the Jazz Age. So one of the things that you want to be able to do, I mentioned on the objective slide, is be able to explain the impact and development of jazz throughout the 1920s. And jazz largely was a genre of music that was based largely on improvisation, and it grew out of blues music that came decades before, and ragtime music, which also came decades before. Basically, all you really need to remember and know is that was a kind of a combination of different kinds of music, including, like I said, African-American blues music, European-based popular music. So jazz was kind of a compilation of all these kinds of musics, and it emerged largely in the South and the Midwest. Okay, in the South, particularly in New Orleans, where there were a lot of different cultures and traditions that were coming together. Jazz artists in the South won a lot of fame. In Storyville, which was a section of New Orleans known for its popular nightlife. And from the South, jazz started to spread north then with and along the Great Migration of African Americans. So it just, common sense should tell you that as African Americans migrated north, they would bring this new genre of music known as jazz with them. And the cool thing about jazz is that it wasn't just specific to African Americans. In other words, it crossed racial lines, and it became a genre of music that was loved and appealed to everyone. And it became, like it says here, a uniquely American art form. Right? And one of the most prominent jazz musicians of the day was the famous New Orleans trumpet player Louis Armstrong. And Armstrong became the official, probably more the unofficial ambassador of jazz music. And he was a famous trumpet player in King Oliver's band in New Orleans and also in Chicago. And he also played in a guy named Fletcher Henderson's orchestra in New York City. But he also began to organize his own groups. He was a trumpet player, connoisseur, expert. If you don't believe me, just go ahead and YouTube Louis Armstrong trumpet, and he was incredible. He, of course, is a legend in jazz music, but just music in general. And he actually influenced how jazz developed over time. For example, after Armstrong came about, or what Armstrong was known for was the trumpet solo during a jazz piece, a performance. And he brought that into many jazz performances. In fact, all jazz bands, once they saw Louis Armstrong play, all jazz bands featured some sort of soloist because of his influence. And many other jazz bands started to feature vocal soloists, like Bessie Smith, who was another world-renowned, or at least U.S.-renowned jazz performer. She was known as the Empress of the Blues. So it wasn't just Louis Armstrong, but it was others. But Louis Armstrong was kind of the forerunner, the pioneer, the man who would have such an influence on jazz that it caused other jazz bands to copy what he was doing. Now, jazz music became such a huge influence on the United States, certainly because of the spread, the innovation of the radio. We talked about that in the last section. And also records, the phonograph. And The thing to remember about jazz is that it not just gained U.S. popularity, but it was worldwide, a worldwide phenomenon. And it was more than just a musical style. Jazz became, I suppose you could say, kind of a symbol of the 1920s. It was part of the Prohibition era, right? Jazz was played in speakeasies. It was played in night spots all over New York and Chicago and your big cities, Detroit and St. Louis, Los Angeles. It was, of course, the focal point was the famous nightclub in Harlem known as the Cotton Club. It was one of Harlem's most famous attractions. And photographic records, radio spread the influence of jazz all around the country and, of course, all around the world. And by the end of the decade, the popularity of jazz had spread to Europe as well. So jazz was one of those things that quickly bridged the two races together. It was one of those things that kind of brought the two races together because the genre of jazz music appealed to everyone. And I already mentioned Bessie Smith being one of the more famous solo vocalists. Duke Ellington was also a popular band leader of the day, huge name in jazz music. He arranged or wrote, like I have down here, 2,000 pieces of music, won multiple awards worldwide. Others include Cole Porter, Irving Berlin. You might have heard of some of these. George Gershwin also found inspiration in much of the music they wrote later on in jazz of the 1920s. So at this point, I would like for you to pause me because there are a couple of videos, or at least one video here that I'd like you to watch. You will want to watch it. I've mentioned in the past, these are beneficial. These will do you good. And again, it adds some action and some color to all of this. So find the 7.5 Google Slides, the active slides, the live slides link in the folder for today, Friday. And this is the slide that you're going to be looking for, the Harlem Renaissance. It's going to give you a quick overview of how the Harlem Renaissance developed, how it came into being. And when you're done with it, come on back, visit me again, and we'll continue. Okay, so pause me now. Okay, welcome back, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video on the Harlem Renaissance. And what you want to take now moving forward is that the jazz age and blues were part of this rebirth or this blossoming of African American culture known as the Harlem Renaissance, right? And jazz and blues music were an expression, right, of the African American experience during this time. And it's this blossoming and flowering of culture, the African American culture is what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance would help give new vocabulary and dynamic to race relations in the United States, relations between whites and blacks. In the 1920s, the term the new Negro started to enter American vocabulary. And what this term suggested is that there was some sort of break from the past, from the Jim Crow era of the 1870s, 80s, 1890s, and early 1900s. It was hoped that this new mood during the Harlem Renaissance expressed it was expressed through novels, it was expressed through poets, it was expressed through journalists all over the country and beyond. These new Harlem Renaissance ideas that celebrated culture, it explored questions of race and race relations in America. Some of the more prominent Harlem Renaissance writers, one was Gene Toomer. This kind of set the tone. This book did in 1923. This was a book, a collection of short stories and sketches. And what Gene Toomer did is that she presented African American life and folk culture in this book, in these short stories. And it was very influential as the decade went on. One of the more popular and influential poets of the day was a Jamaican immigrant named Claude McKay, and his writings started to emphasize the dignity of African Americans. And many in his writings, in his poems and novels, he started to call for a social and political change among the African American community. So there were hints there of kind of a civil rights movement right? Not a movement so much, but calls for more civil rights that started to come through in many of these people's writings. And Claude McKay was one of the more prominent writers of the day. And speaking of one of the more prominent writers, you do want to remember and be familiar with who Langston Hughes was. Okay, Langston Hughes is arguably probably the most noted and the most celebrated Harlem Renaissance writer. He was a political voice. He was a strong advocate and voice during the Harlem Renaissance. For Hughes, in much of what he wrote, the force of the Harlem Renaissance really wasn't about politics, but as much as it was as a celebration of African American culture and life. So he wrote more than, I think it was about 50 works of fiction, including poetry, journalism, critiques. He talked much about the diversity of the African American person and life, and he even wrote his own autobiography. So one of the clips here that you're going to watch shortly is about Langston Hughes and the influence he had on the Harlem Renaissance. And then another prominent writer of the day was Zora Neale Hurston. There is a picture of her, I believe, in your textbook. She published a lot of folk tales, and she traveled around many rural parts of the country, primarily in Florida. And her books include Mules and Men, and Their Eyes Were Watching God. And what she does here is she speaks of kind of from a women's perspective, longing for independence and becoming more of a social and political force in society, or African American women. So there you have four prominent writers, two of which, Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. And that's what I want you to watch next. So pause me now, and you'll be able to watch this short clip here on Langston Hughes, all right? And when you return, we'll continue on. So pause me now. Okay, guys, welcome back. What I'd like you to do now is pause me again. And this particular video, I believe it's the last of the series of slides, is mainly images and photographs. And what you're going to see here are pictures and photographs specifically from the Harlem Renaissance. These are all primary source documents, you could call them. So I want you to watch and go through this PBS video. It's about 4 minutes. You'll notice that it's in the format of a news show. Okay, it's from the news show, the PBS NewsHour. And I just want you to watch it and pause me then. And when you're done, come back and we'll finish up the lecture. So pause me now. Okay, welcome back, guys. Last slide of this lecture. One of the things to keep in mind is here that as the Great Depression began by 1920 and 1930, the Harlem Renaissance largely came to an end. So it was one of those things that was about a decade long. Okay, so about 1921 to 1930. So you can say it was around 8 to 10 years that this blossoming and flourishing of African American culture took place. But the 8 or 10 years that it did happen would have a large impact or a lasting effect on the self-image of African Americans in the decades to come. It created a sense of group identity among African Americans, a more collective identity, and solidarity among the African American community. And it would also later become kind of the foundation, the bedrock of the civil rights movement. And we're going to start to see signs of that movement already in the 40s during World War II, and then starting getting into the 1950s and certainly 60s when we have people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. on the scene, right when the big civil rights movement, the one that you're probably more familiar with, starts. Okay, but know now that in the 1920s, this is all kind of laying the foundation for what is to come. This is the lasting effects of what is to come, the legacy of what is to come. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. It's the end of the lecture for 7.5. I hope you enjoyed the video clips, and we will talk to you again real soon. All right, thanks, guys. Bye for now.